Dawn broke over Thuringia on October 14, 1806, revealing something unprecedented in military history. 15 miles apart, two massive battles were about to begin simultaneously. At Jena, Napoleon Bonaparte with 54,000 men faced 50,000 Prussians who believed they were fighting the main French army. At Auerstedt, Marshal Davout with 27,000 soldiers was about to collide with 70,000 Prussians who thought they faced only a screening force. Neither French commander knew the other was fighting. Neither Prussian army knew the other existed nearby. In the next 6 hours, this geographic accident would become a double catastrophe that would erase Prussia as a great power and prove that Napoleon's military system had made traditional European warfare obsolete. To understand this day's significance, you need to grasp Prussia's mindset in 1806. They were the heirs of Frederick the Great, the legendary warrior king who'd made Prussia a European power through brilliant victories in the 7 Years' War 50 years earlier. His oblique order, his linear tactics, his iron discipline had been copied by every European army. Prussian officers still worshipped Frederick's methods like Holy Scripture. When they looked at their army, they saw invincibility. When they looked at Napoleon, they saw an upstart who'd gotten lucky against Austrians and Russians. This arrogance was catastrophic because warfare had evolved dramatically in the 50 years since Frederick's death. Napoleon had revolutionized everything. His core system allowed massive armies to move in separate formations that could concentrate rapidly for battle. His artillery was more mobile, his infantry more flexible, his cavalry more decisive. Most importantly, his commanders were trained to show initiative, to adapt, to seize opportunities without waiting for orders. Prussian commanders still waited for the king's personal direction, still fought like it was 1756. The strategic situation on October 14th was the result of Napoleon's brilliant maneuvering. He'd moved his Grande Armée of 180,000 men through Germany with such speed that Prussian commanders were still arguing about where the French were when Napoleon was already behind them, threatening their communications. The Prussian army, roughly 130,000 strong, was scattered across Thuringia trying to find the French. They were about to find them in the worst possible way. At Jena, Napoleon had spent the previous night personally reconnoitering the Landgrafenberg heights, even falling off his horse in the darkness. By dawn, he'd positioned 54,000 men with artillery on the commanding heights overlooking the Prussian position. He could see roughly 50,000 Prussians forming up in the valley, preparing for battle using Frederick's tactics. Long linear formations designed for volley fire and disciplined advances. Napoleon smiled. These tactics were perfect for the 1750s. This was 1806. 15 miles north at Auerstedt, Marshal Davout was in far more dangerous circumstances. His Third Corps of 27,000 men was marching through morning fog when his vanguard collided with what turned out to be the main Prussian army, 70,000 soldiers under King Frederick William III himself. Davout was outnumbered nearly 3-1, cut off from Napoleon, facing the Prussian king and his best generals. Any conventional commander would have retreated immediately. But Davout wasn't conventional. He was the Iron Marshal, Napoleon's most reliable subordinate. He'd hold until destroyed or until he won. There was no third option. This story reaches you in English, the language that connects military history enthusiasts from Sandhurst to West Point, from Canberra to Cape Town, from Toronto to Mumbai. I'm curious, from which corner of the English-speaking world are you watching this? Each nation has faced its own moments when old systems confronted new realities. That's why Jena-Auerstedt still matters. The irony was perfect. At Jena, Napoleon thought he was fighting the main Prussian army when he actually faced only a covering force. At Auerstedt, the Prussian king thought he was fighting a minor French detachment when he actually faced one of history's great commanders. Both sides were wrong about what they faced. But the French system was designed to handle confusion and adapt. The Prussian system required perfect information and royal direction. Chaos favored Napoleon. As the sun rose higher, both battlefields erupted in cannon fire almost simultaneously. At Jena, Napoleon's massed artillery began systematically destroying Prussian formations that stood in neat lines like it was a parade ground. At Auerstedt, Davout's outnumbered corps formed defensive positions and prepared to prove that French tactical superiority could overcome 3-to-1 odds. Prussia's military reputation, built over 50 years, had 6 hours left to live. The twin hammers of tactical evolution were about to fall. On the French side, Napoleon Bonaparte at 37 was at the absolute peak of his powers. In 11 years, he'd risen from artillery captain to Emperor of France, conquering Italy, Egypt, Austria, and establishing French dominance over continental Europe. But his greatest achievement wasn't territorial, it was systematic. He'd created a military machine that moved faster, hit harder, and adapted better than anything Europe had seen. The corps system was his masterpiece, self-sufficient divisions of 20,000, 30,000 men that could march separately, fight independently, and concentrate rapidly for decisive battle. His Grande Armée in 1806 numbered roughly 180,000 men organized into 7 corps plus the Imperial Guard. Each corps had its own infantry, cavalry, and artillery, commanded by a marshal who'd proven himself in a dozen campaigns. This wasn't just an army, it was 7 armies that could operate independently yet support each other. When concentrated, they were unstoppable. When dispersed, they were still deadly. Prussian generals watching French movements were confused because the French didn't move like traditional armies. They moved like fluid, each corps flowing toward objectives, then suddenly coalescing for battle. Marshal Louis-Nicolas Davout was Napoleon's secret weapon. At 36, he was known as the Iron Marshal for his rigid discipline and unshakable resolve. Unlike flashier marshals like Murat or Ney, Davout never sought glory, only results. His Third Corps was the Grande Armée's best. 27,000 superbly trained veterans who'd march 30 miles in a day, then fight a battle. Davout had never lost an engagement. His men trusted him absolutely because he led from the front, but never wasted their lives. On October 14th, that trust would be tested against impossible odds. The French tactical advantage was profound. Their infantry fought in columns that could maneuver rapidly, then deploy into line for firepower when needed. Their artillery was mobile, could reposition quickly, and was integrated into combined arms tactics. Their cavalry ranged ahead for reconnaissance, screened movements, and pursued broken enemies. Most importantly, French officers at every level were trained to seize initiative. If an opportunity appeared, they took it without waiting for orders from above. Facing this evolved system was Prussia's military aristocracy, still living in Frederick the Great's shadow. Their senior commanders averaged over 60 years old. The Duke of Brunswick, commanding at Auerstedt, was 71. General Mühlendorf was 82. These weren't just old men, they were men whose military education had stopped in 1763 when Frederick's wars ended. They'd spent 40 years studying his battles, memorizing his tactics, treating his methods as eternal truth. They couldn't conceive that warfare had evolved beyond what Frederick had perfected. If this story of how military innovation destroyed tradition, of how one day can obsolete an entire system, is gripping you, you need to subscribe to Unfinished Battles and hit that like button. Because what happens in the next 6 hours isn't just 2 battles, it's the death of an era and the birth of modern warfare. The lessons from this day still shape how militaries think about adaptation and evolution. Prussian tactics were Frederick's tactics, long linear formations, 3 ranks deep, designed to maximize musket volleys. Infantry would advance in perfect lines, halt, fire synchronized volleys, then advance again. It required iron discipline and looked magnificent on parade. Against enemies using similar tactics, it worked. Against French columns that could maneuver around flanks, concentrate against weak points, and adapt to terrain, it was suicide. Prussian cavalry was still excellent, their infantry still brave, their artillery still competent. But their system was designed for a war that no longer existed. The force distribution on October 14th told the story. Napoleon at Jena commanded 54,000 men with another 42,000 in supporting corps nearby. Davout at Auerstedt had 27,000. Total French forces engaged, roughly 96,000. The Prussians had approximately 50,000 at Jena under Prince Hohenlohe and 70,000 at Auerstedt under the king himself. Total Prussian forces, roughly 120,000. On paper, Prussia had numerical advantage. But numbers meant nothing when one side was fighting with 1760 tactics against an enemy using 1806 methods. The final element was psychological. French soldiers believed they were invincible because they kept winning. They'd beaten Austrians, Russians, and various coalition armies. They trusted Napoleon absolutely, knowing he'd used their lives wisely and delivered victories. Prussian soldiers believed that they were invincible because of Frederick's legacy, because their drill sergeants told them so, because they'd never faced real defeat. Both armies thought they'd win. Only one had evidence supporting that belief. As morning progressed on October 14th, both battlefields were set. At Jena, Napoleon had numerical parity and perfect terrain. At Auerstedt, Davout was badly outnumbered but commanded the Grande Armée's finest corps. The Prussians at both locations formed their traditional lines and prepared to demonstrate Frederick's methods. They had no idea they were about to become object lessons in why militaries must evolve or die. At 6:30 a.m., as morning fog lifted over Thuringia, both battles exploded into violence almost simultaneously. 15 miles apart, two Prussian armies were about to learn the same brutal lesson. Frederick the Great's tactics were 40 years obsolete, and obsolete systems don't just lose battles, they get annihilated. At Jena, Napoleon had positioned his artillery on the Landgrafenberg heights overlooking the Prussian positions. When he gave the signal, 120 French guns opened fire with devastating effect. The Prussian formations, arrayed in perfect linear order as Frederick's drill books mandated, made magnificent targets. Each cannonball that struck a line would tear through multiple men, the tight formation ensuring maximum casualties per shot. Prussian officers screamed orders to hold formation, to maintain the line. The men obeyed, standing in neat rows while French artillery methodically destroyed them. Prince Hohenlohe, commanding the 50,000 Prussians at Jena, couldn't understand what was happening. His men were in perfect formation, exactly as Frederick had taught. But the French weren't fighting correctly. Their infantry advanced in columns, not lines, moving rapidly around Prussian flanks. When Prussian units wheeled to face these threats, they exposed themselves to artillery fire from different angles. The coordinated combined arms tactics Napoleon had perfected were overwhelming the rigid Prussian system. 15 miles north, Davout was fighting for his life. His 27,000 men of the Third Corps faced 70,000 Prussians, including the king himself and the legendary Duke of Brunswick. The odds were catastrophic. Any traditional commander would have retreated immediately, conceding the field to preserve his force. But Davout understood something crucial. He didn't need to win decisively, he just needed to not lose long enough for his tactical superiority to matter. His corps formed defensive positions using terrain masterfully, creating killing zones where Prussian masses would be channeled into French firepower. The Duke of Brunswick, at 71 years old, ordered attacks using Frederick's oblique order. Concentrate force on one Prussian wing while refusing the other. It had worked brilliantly in 1757. In 1806, against an enemy that could rapidly redeploy and concentrate firepower at threatened points, it was suicide. French battalion commanders trained to show initiative, identified Prussian weak points, and attacked them without waiting for Davout's orders. The Prussian command system, which required direction from the top, couldn't respond to threats developing faster than messengers could ride. By 8 a.m., both Prussian armies were in serious trouble. At Jena, Napoleon's corps were converging from multiple directions, executing the concentration he'd planned. Marshal Lannes attacked from the north, Augereau from the west. Soult was positioning to strike the Prussian rear. Prince Hohenlohe found his army being encircled by enemies who'd marched separately but fought together. His linear formations couldn't face multiple directions simultaneously without breaking apart. At Auerstedt, something remarkable was happening. Despite being outnumbered nearly 3-1, Davout's corps was holding. More than holding, they were inflicting disproportionate casualties. Every Prussian attack met concentrated defensive fire from positions Davout's officers had chosen expertly. French artillery, more mobile than Prussian guns, repositioned rapidly to hit Prussian formations from flanking angles. When Prussians tried their traditional measured advance, French light infantry in skirmish order picked off officers and disrupted formations before the lines even closed. Then disaster struck the Prussian command at Auerstedt. The Duke of Brunswick, riding forward to observe the battle personally as Frederick would have, took a musket ball through both eyes. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded. Command chaos erupted. Who was in charge? The king? But Frederick William III had never commanded in battle. General Schmettau? He was 73 years old. As Prussian officers argued about succession, French attacks intensified, exploiting the confusion ruthlessly. By 9 a.m., both Prussian forces were crumbling. At Jena, entire regiments were breaking and fleeing as French combined arms attacks overwhelmed them. Cavalry charges scattered Prussian infantry who'd lost formation cohesion. Artillery fire pursued retreating units. The Prussian position was collapsing from multiple directions, exactly as Napoleon's system was designed to achieve. Hohenlohe tried rally points, tried reforming lines, but his men were learning that standing in neat rows just made them better targets. At Auerstedt, the impossible was happening. Davout's 27,000 weren't just surviving against 70,000, they were winning. Prussian morale was cracking as attack after attack failed with heavy casualties. These were supposed to be the heirs of Frederick's invincible army. They were supposed to sweep aside French detachments easily. Instead, they were being systematically dismantled by a corps that moved faster, shot better, and adapted quicker than anything in their experience. The realization spread through Prussian ranks. They weren't just losing a battle, their entire military system was being proven worthless. By 10 a.m., both Prussian armies had transitioned from retreat to rout. At Jena, Prince Hohenlohe's 50,000 men were fleeing in disorder, abandoning artillery, colors, and all semblance of formation. Napoleon's cavalry, sensing blood, launched pursuit. Marshal Murat's light cavalry slashed into the fleeing masses, turning organized withdrawal into panicked flight. Prussian soldiers threw away weapons to run faster. Officers abandoned their men. Entire regiments dissolved into mobs of terrified individuals running for their lives. What had been Frederick the Great's proud army 6 hours ago was now a broken rabble. At Auerstedt, the miracle was complete. Davout's 27,000 men had not just survived against 70,000 Prussians, they'd broken them. The Prussian king, watching his army disintegrate, ordered general retreat. But retreat required organization, and the Prussian command structure had collapsed with Brunswick's wounding. Different units received different orders. Some tried forming rearguards, others fled immediately. The result was chaos that French cavalry exploited mercilessly. Davout's troopers pursued Prussians who outnumbered them 3-1 and cut them down like harvesting wheat. Then catastrophe became apocalypse. The two retreating Prussian armies, unaware of each other's existence, converged on the same roads heading north toward Weimar. Around 11 a.m., Hohenlohe's fleeing troops from Jena collided with the king's retreating forces from Auerstedt. Two panicked mobs met on narrow roads in total confusion. Nobody knew which units belonged to which army. Officers screamed contradictory orders. Artillery trains blocked infantry columns. Cavalry tried forcing through packed roads, trampling their own infantry. It was organizational collapse on a scale rarely seen in military history. French cavalry, pursuing both Prussian forces, arrived to find their enemies doing their work for them. The Prussians were so tangled in massive traffic jams that they couldn't form defensive positions. They could barely move. French horsemen rode alongside the stalled columns, sabering helpless infantry who couldn't deploy from march column to fighting formation. Prussian officers tried surrendering, but in the chaos, French cavalry couldn't always take prisoners. The slaughter continued. The casualty disparity told the story of systemic failure. By noon, Prussian losses approached 25,000 men, 10,000 dead, 15,000 captured. French casualties across both battles, roughly 5,000, most at Auerstedt where Davout had faced the worst odds. The ratio was 5 Prussians lost for every Frenchman. But numbers don't capture the psychological devastation. Prussia's officer corps, the embodiment of Frederick's legacy, was shattered. Hundreds of officers were dead or captured. The survivors had watched their tactics, their training, their entire military philosophy proven worthless in 6 hours. By early afternoon, both battles were effectively over. At Jena, Napoleon surveyed the field littered with 15,000 Prussian casualties and abandoned equipment. At Auerstedt, Davout received reports that stunned even him. His 27,000 had routed 70,000, inflicting 13,000 casualties while suffering 7,000 themselves. When Napoleon learned what Davout had accomplished 15 miles away, he initially didn't believe it. One corps defeating the main Prussian army while Napoleon fought a secondary force seemed impossible. But the evidence was undeniable. What followed was perhaps even more remarkable than the battles themselves. As news of the twin disasters spread, Prussian fortresses that could have held out for months surrendered without firing a shot. Magdeburg, supposedly impregnable, surrendered its 20,000-man garrison to a French force 1/4 that size. Stettin capitulated to 800 French cavalry. The psychological impact was total. If Prussia's field army could be destroyed in 6 hours, what hope did isolated garrisons have? King Frederick William III, fleeing toward Königsberg, faced the complete destruction of everything his ancestor had built. The military system that Frederick the Great had perfected, that had made Prussia a European power, had been rendered obsolete and crushed in a single morning. 50 years of legacy, gone in 6 hours. The survivors weren't just defeated soldiers, they were men who'd watched their entire worldview collapse. They'd believed Prussian methods were eternal truth. Napoleon had proven them historical artifacts. Prussia's shock was existential. How could the heirs of Frederick be annihilated so completely, so quickly? How could 120,000 Prussians lose to 96,000 French at 2 separate battles on the same morning? The answer was uncomfortable but unavoidable. Prussia had been fighting 1806's war with 1760's methods against an enemy who'd revolutionized warfare. Tradition had met evolution. Evolution won. The immediate aftermath of October 14, 1806, was Prussia's complete collapse as a military power. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon occupied Berlin. By the end of November, virtually every Prussian fortress had surrendered. An army of 250,000 that existed in September had ceased to exist by December. The Treaty of Tilsit in 1807 reduced Prussia to half its former size, stripped it of its western territories, and imposed crushing financial penalties. The state that Frederick the Great had elevated to great power status was reduced to a French satellite. One day, 2 battles, 6 hours, had accomplished what years of warfare might not have achieved. Napoleon's dominance over continental Europe was now absolute. Austria had been defeated at Austerlitz in 1805. Prussia was destroyed at Jena-Auerstedt in 1806. Russia would be fought to a draw at Eylau and Friedland in 1807. Britain remained undefeated but isolated on its island. From the Atlantic to the Russian border, from the North Sea to the Mediterranean, French power was unchallenged. And it all traced back to the systematic superiority demonstrated in those 6 hours across 2 battlefields in Thuringia. The tactical revolution Jena-Auerstedt demonstrated became the foundation of modern military thinking. Linear warfare, which had dominated European battlefields for a century, was dead. The future belonged to flexible formations, combined arms coordination, mission-based tactics, and decentralized command. Every European army spent the next decade studying what Napoleon had done and trying to copy it. The Prussians, characteristically thorough, studied it best and eventually used those lessons to defeat Napoleon's successors. Yet history has been unkind to Davout's achievement at Auerstedt. Napoleon's victory at Jena gets the attention because Napoleon was there. But militarily, Davout's triumph was far more impressive. He defeated the main Prussian army with barely a third of its numbers, killed or captured the Prussian command structure, and did it all while operating independently 15 miles from Napoleon. It's arguably the most overlooked great victory in military history. One corps, 27,000 men, destroying 70,000 enemies, including a king and his guard. Davout deserves to be mentioned alongside Hannibal, Caesar, and Napoleon himself for that morning's work. Modern military academies worldwide study Jena-Auerstedt as a case study in systemic superiority. It's not taught as two separate battles, but as one campaign demonstrating how organizational innovation defeats institutional rigidity. The core system that allowed French forces to move separately but fight together. The mission-oriented tactics that empowered subordinate commanders to show initiative. The combined arms coordination that multiplied combat effectiveness. All of these concepts are foundational to modern military doctrine, and all were demonstrated perfectly on October 14, 1806. Ironically, Prussia's catastrophic defeat became the catalyst for its eventual resurgence. The disaster forced comprehensive military reforms led by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. They studied Napoleon's methods, copied what worked, adapted it to Prussian culture, and created the general staff system that would dominate European warfare for the next century. The Prussian army that fought in the Wars of Liberation, 1813, 1815, bore little resemblance to the fossilized force destroyed at Jena-Auerstedt. Defeat had forced evolution. By 1870, Prussia's reformed military would crush France, the ultimate revenge. The broader lesson transcends military history. Jena-Auerstedt demonstrates what happens when institutions refuse to evolve. Prussia's army in 1806 was trapped in Frederick the Great's shadow, treating his methods as eternal truth rather than products of their era. When confronted by an enemy who'd adapted and innovated, they collapsed catastrophically. Every organization, military or civilian, faces this challenge. Evolve with changing circumstances or become obsolete. Tradition is valuable, but tradition that refuses adaptation becomes a suicide pact. If this story of how one day changed European history, of how innovation destroyed tradition, of how 96,000 defeated 120,000 through systematic superiority has inspired you, subscribe to Unfinished Battles, hit that like button, and comment telling me which country you're watching from. History is full of moments when the old order met the new, when evolution confronted stagnation. Share which ones resonate with your nation's story. And explore our channel for more battles where the outcome wasn't determined by numbers, but by who'd adapted better to warfare's evolution. In 6 hours across two battlefields 15 miles apart, Napoleon's system destroyed Prussia's legacy. 96,000 French proved that in war, evolution beats tradition, flexibility defeats rigidity, and adaptation is survival. The armies of Frederick the Great met the armies of the future and learned that nostalgia for past glory is no substitute for present excellence.